are conducive to the cohesion of the society are more likely to survive in cultural evolution than religions that don't.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Andres. And that made me feel very important. Thank you for that. Jamie, for a second there, I almost believed I was the King of England while that video was going on, but not quite. And thank all of you for staying around long enough to listen to me. The program says I'm going to talk about the animal, and I am. More specifically, I'm going to talk about the human animal and human nature as it has evolved, and I'm going to focus in particular on the question of why human animals sometimes have a hard time getting along, sometimes fight with one another, as they're doing now in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, and in lots of other places, and as they've done throughout history. The way this question is sometimes put is, why can't the good side of human nature prevail? Okay, in other words, humans are clearly capable of compassion. They're capable of appreciating the golden rule, that is the idea that you should do to other people things that you would want done to you. You should treat others as you want to be treated. So why can't these parts of human nature prevail? And I think the best way to address this question is to look at how these parts of human nature were built, how they evolved, what natural selection designed them for. So I'm going to give you kind of a quick natural history of some good parts of human nature. And as I do this, you're going to notice that there's a pattern, a kind of a good news, bad news pattern, okay? That is, for every kind of good part of human nature, there seems to be some downside or some limitation or some dark underside, okay? And I think that speaks to the way we really are built, okay, the way human nature really is, that the good and the bad is very finely intertwined. It's not that the bad part evolved a long time ago when we were animals and the good part is now trying to overcome the bad part. I think the two have evolved in tandem all along. Okay, so I'm going to start with compassion. I think compassion has been with our species a long time. In fact, I suspect it's been in our lineage since before there were human beings, before we had reached the human level of evolution. And evolutionary biologists have a pretty good, somewhat conjectural idea of how things like compassion first entered our lineage. It would have been through the logic of something called kin selection. And the idea of kin selection is that if an animal feels compassion for another animal in its family that it's related to, and the compassion leads it to help that animal, then in the long run, this is actually helping the genes underlying the compassion, okay, help them spread. So from a Darwinian point of view, you could say that compassion is just a gene's way of helping itself. Now, some people are bothered by this. I'm actually not. What bothers me is the other implication of this kind of kin-selected compassion, which is the idea that it's only extended to the family. You don't naturally extend this kind of compassion to people you're not related to. Now, fortunately, there seems to be the case that a second evolutionary dynamic came along. But first of all, you can already see that there's a kind of a good news, bad news thing here, right? It's good that compassion is natural, has a basis in our genes. It's bad that it is naturally confined in its reach, okay? Now, fortunately, there's a second evolutionary dynamic called reciprocal altruism, which seems to have allowed us to extend some of our social instincts, our concerns, maybe even compassion beyond the family, okay? And the idea there is that if you feel compassion for someone who's not in your family, and that leads you to help them, and they later return the favor, then in the long run, you're still helping yourself if you get into a steady relationship with this person of reciprocal altruism. This doesn't mean that you're consciously seeking the reciprocation. It just means that this is why this sort of compassion would have evolved. This would have been kind of natural selection's agenda, so to speak. Okay, so again, there's good news. You know, that now compassion and things, feelings like that can be extended beyond the family. The bad news is that they are still confined in their application, okay, because you would still only naturally extend them to people, to friends and allies, basically, people you swap favors with, people you have common interests with. There's another implication, though, of reciprocal altruism, I think. That's also kind of good news, which is I think that this dynamic has given us all a kind of appreciation for the golden rule, the idea that you should treat others as you want to be treated. I don't mean that the golden rule is written into our genes in the sense of an instinctive belief, but I think we're naturally receptive to it. And in fact, you can go to pretty much, you know, I think any hunter-gatherer society, and if you stick around long enough and listen to them, and, you know, and these are people who have not been exposed to Greek philosophy or any of the modern religions, but I think you will find the belief that good deeds should be rewarded and bad deeds should be punished. That's not quite the same as believing the golden rule, but it inclines you in that direction. And I think in that sense, the golden rule is kind of, human nature is very amenable to this idea. And in fact, most people, if you ask them, do you believe the golden rule? They'll say yes. Okay, so that's the good news. Well, obviously there must be bad news, right, if there's good news. And in this case, the bad news is that the golden rule, we naturally exclude certain people from it. We all say that we should treat people as we want to be treated, but none of us actually does that, okay? Because none of us would want to be in prison, and yet we all believe that there are some people who should be in prison. So those people we're not treating as we would like to be treated. Now, it's true we have a reason for not treating them that way. Okay, they committed a crime, and I believe that, you know, you do have to put some people in prison. But the fact is, none of us really applies the golden rule in a kind of universal way. And there's a slightly bigger problem, which is that in the case of putting someone in jail, you could say, well, there's this judicial process that determined them to be guilty. We didn't do this casually. But I think in everyday life, we all do exclude people from the golden rule pretty casually. And the rule of thumb is, if they are your rival or your enemy, then you do not apply the golden rule to them. You don't treat them as you would want to be treated. So if you're in Hamas, you would not want somebody to shoot missiles at you. You shoot them at Israel, and you say, well, but the Israelis, or at least some Israelis, did something to make them deserve this. And if you're an Israeli, you would not yourself want to be subjected to an economic blockade the way Gaza is now subjected to an economic blockade. But you say the Palestinians, or some of them, brought it upon themselves. And this is the way it basically works. We just kind of naturally exclude people we define as enemies or rivals from the application of the golden rule. So we are still a long way from kind of universal brotherhood here. And there is one, notwithstanding the fact that so far the good news has been exactly counterbalanced by the bad news, I would say, there is one piece of good news that I actually like to think could be kind of the salvation of the world, okay? And I'm not going to tell you what that is right away, because I want to try to hold your attention while I take you through some slightly dry academic terrain to prepare you for what I'm saying is the good news. So I hope you'll just pay attention to this for a couple of minutes. I'm going to take a detour to say a little something about game theory, okay? The idea of zero-sum and non-zero-sum games before I give you this piece of world-saving good news. If you ask what kinds of conditions lead us to define some people as enemies and some people as friends, the way a game theorist would answer that question is they'd say, well, a zero-sum dynamic leads you to define them as enemies or at least rivals. A non-zero-sum dynamic is going to make you more likely to call them friends or allies. Okay, so what do we mean by zero-sum and non-zero-sum? Well, a zero-sum game is the kind of game you're familiar with mainly through sports, where there's a winner and a loser. Okay, so if you take football, for example, and I know in Mexico, football means something different from what it means in America. In Mexico, football is a game where they actually kick the ball with the foot. In America, football is a game where they throw the ball and catch it with their hands. So I don't know why they call it football in America. I think maybe there was already a sport called handball or something, so they called it football. But In any event, in any sport, including football, let's take Mexico's World Cup team. When a goal is scored in a game they're in, it's going to be good for one team and bad for the other. So if you add up their fortunes add up to 0. That's why it's called zero-sum. Okay, their fortunes are inversely correlated in a zero-sum game. Now, on the other hand, if you ask, what is the relationship between people on the same team? Okay, all the players on the Mexican team, every goal scored is going to be either good for all of them or bad for all of them. So their fortunes are correlated. It'll be win-win or lose-lose. That's a non-zero-sum outcome, a non-zero-sum game. So that's a non-zero-sum game is a game where you are to some extent in the same boat, and your fortunes are correlated. And in a way, you could restate what I said in the early part of this talk by saying that things like compassion more easily flow along non-zero-sum channels. That's the way we naturally deploy them. And we more naturally deploy the golden rule along non-zero-sum channels. So kind of webs of non-zero-sumness should, in theory, be fertile ground for compassion and the treatment of other people as we would like to be treated. Okay, here's the good news. It may save the world. It may not save the world, but I think it's kind of good. And that is just that in the course of history, ever since the Stone Age, the kind of webs of non-zero-sumness have grown. These webs that could expand compassion and so on. They have tended to grow. Ever since the invention of the wheel and the road and writing and so on, we've seen the development of technologies that allow more and more people to play non-zero-sum games with people further and further away so that their fortunes are intertwined with them. And this is why social organization has grown, I think, from hunter-gatherer village through ancient state to empire. And now we're on the verge of a global society. We're not there yet. We don't have a cohesive global society. But certainly, if you ask what does hold the global society together to the extent that it's being held together, what is kind of the essence of globalization, I would say it's non-zero-sum relationships, okay? Many more than people are even aware of. Most people, when they buy a car, they don't realize that they're really playing a non-zero-sum game with workers in many different countries. Okay, they're actually helping to pay the wages of those workers, and those workers help build them a car. That's globalization at work. These correlations of fortune between people all the way around the world. We saw this very vividly with the economic collapse, where the collapse was kind of bad for the world generally, and recovery would be good for the world pretty generally. That's a global correlation of fortunes that tells you that to some extent these non-zero-sum dynamics have gone worldwide. There are lots of non-zero-sum dynamics. Environmental problems that afflict the whole globe put all of us in the same boat, non-zero-sum. Diseases can spread so easily along transportation corridors that it's good for all of us to keep them confined, and bad for all of us if they're not confined. So there are lots of, the spread of weapons of mass destruction, I would say, is bad for just about everyone, and we should all be doing more than we are to control that. So one question is, if there are all these non-zero-sum dynamics around the world, binding the world in some sense, in a material sense, why is it that why is the world not suffused in compassion and brotherhood? And there are a lot of answers. That would be the occasion for a talk in itself. But certainly, for one thing, there are a lot of zero-sum games still going on. There are conflicts of interest. Nations compete for things. People compete for land. That's a zero-sum game. So it's not all non-zero-sum. But it's also the case that I think a lot of times there are non-zero-sum dynamics and people are not aware of them. So, for example, you take Christians in America and Muslims halfway around the world. A lot of them would not think of themselves as playing a non-zero-sum game with the other, as being in the same boat with the other. And yet, when you think about it, they are. Because if the Muslims get less and less happy with their place in the world, feel disrespected, less and less content, that will probably create more terrorism, which will be bad for the Christians in America. Whereas if the Muslims get happier with their place in life, that will be good for the Christians. But I think a lot of people don't think of it that way. And this is the key, by the way, with a non-zero-sum game. If you're going to activate whatever machinery we have for naturally playing non-zero-sum games, you have to recognize it as a non-zero-sum game. And I think there are probably psychological cues that signal the presence of a non-zero-sum game to us. For one, for example, I would guess is maybe respect. If someone is not respecting you, then the chances aren't very good you're going to have a fruitful relationship with them, a mutually fruitful relationship with them. So I think, and this has been an issue in America with American foreign policy, because I think Americans aren't always aware of the perception they're giving people around the world, which sometimes is a perception that that we don't respect them. If you send signals of disrespect, it's going to be harder to convince people to get into a collaborative game with you. I would say still the past offers some hope. I would say, for example, look at, say, American relations with Japan. During World War II, Japanese were depicted as really almost subhuman in American culture. We dropped atomic bombs on them, and there was almost no discussion about that as a moral issue. That was just not a big deal. Today, relations are much better, and I think it has something to do with the fact that A, we're not enemies anymore, B, we are economically intertwined with the Japanese. And I do think that economic engagement can be a benign force in that way. There's also evidence, I think, in the ancient past that these non-zero-sum dynamics can pay off. I published a book a few years ago that Andres mentioned, The Evolution of God, in which I argued that all three Abrahamic religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, have in the past demonstrated their capacity, when they sense themselves to be in the non-zero-sum game with other peoples, they develop the doctrines of tolerance that facilitate interaction with those people. So I think it can, this can work. I mean, I think it's a good thing that it's a more non-zero-sum world. But if there's one thing I would say we could do to help press the process along, it would be to exercise your moral imaginations. And by moral imagination, I mean the ability to put yourself in the shoes of someone in circumstances very different from yours, who behaves very differently from you, and maybe even behaves in a way that you find bad. And try to understand what makes them, why they see the world the way they do, and try to see if you can even imagine yourself seeing the world that way. Because I do think that if you appreciate the commonality you have with people, if you appreciate that indeed if you had been in somebody's shoes since birth, yes, you might be doing roughly what they're doing. That opens you up to the idea, at least, that maybe you have some commonalities in a larger way. That maybe you have your fates are correlated, and you should cooperate with them. Now, the extreme case of this kind of experiment for an American would be, say, to take somebody like someone burning an American flag in Iran, say, and try to put yourself in their shoes and try to relate your situation to theirs. And people have a lot of trouble with this. Like if you say, well, they may feel kind of disrespected by America, or that America's trying to dominate them in a way that makes them hate America. Have you ever felt that way about anyone? Even though we have all felt that way about people, at least I have. And I hope it's not just because I'm unusually bad. I hope I like to think I'm not worse than average. I think most people are like this. It's hard for Americans to acknowledge any similarity at all. And I'm not saying that to do that, in doing that, the point is to exonerate the flag burning, or say, if you do the extreme version of the experiment, to say exonerate anything Osama bin Laden does. But I do think it's a useful exercise, if only for kind of strategic reasons. That is, to understand why people hate America. That would be useful information for Americans, just in a practical sense. So now, there's been another bad news story in this moral imagination thing that I haven't talked about, which is that the ability to put ourselves in the shoes of other people does seem to be a natural thing. But again, it doesn't seem to be natural to do it with people you consider enemies or rivals. We actively resist that precisely because we do think it would exonerate parts of their behavior we don't approve of. So once again, there's kind of moral machinery, and I think it's good that we have moral imagination, but unfortunately we don't naturally deploy it in a very broad way. We tend to confine it to kind of friends and allies or so on, and I'm arguing that it would be in our interest to exercise our moral imaginations, no matter how abhorrent it seems in some cases, to try to identify in any sense with people who have done terrible things, okay? So it's because it's a hard thing to do, it's the kind of thing that this exercise of the moral imagination will probably take leadership from people who in positions of political leadership, business leadership, educational leadership, whatever. I think that, you know, they can help encourage people to do this kind of work. But really, you know, all of us, whether or not we're in leadership positions, have influence with people. We all talk to friends about current events, and we talk to friends about people in other cultures or in very other parts of our own societies, in different, maybe of a very much lower income level than ours, and we look at their behavior, we discuss it, and you can either try to emphasize your commonality with these people when you discuss it with your friends, or you can't. And I encourage trying. And maybe if we all try, then we can increase the amount of good news in the world and decrease the amount of bad news. Thank you.
Thank you very much.